This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Simon Black, an investor, entrepreneur, and founder of Sovereign Man. Even if you don't immediately recognize Simon's name, I guarantee you have read his writing. Simon has a travel perspective, and that perspective has given him unique insights on freedom, making money, keeping more of it, and protecting it from the government. Whatever government that might be, Simon has great insights on how to keep more of your hard-earned capital. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Simon Black. Simon, for those people not familiar with you, and I think they've probably seen your writing or seen something that you've been involved with, maybe they didn't know it was you exactly, they see the name Sovereign Man. I want to know your start. How did you, and define yourself, define the Sovereign Man, but what was your start? How did you go down this path?
It actually started with my background in the military. I went to West Point and graduated. I was commissioned as an Army intelligence officer. This was 15, 16 years ago. And I was, my unit, I was stationed in the Middle East, basically right around the time that George W. Bush was insisting that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Basically, it became abundantly clear that that was a total fabrication, that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And I knew that going into the invasion of Iraq. And it just set me down this path where I realized sort of everything that I had been brought up to believe was bullshit. That if they were lying about something so important as the reason to go to war, then they were probably lying about other stuff too. You know, I started investigating. Well, if they're lying about this, what else are they lying about? And it turns out they're lying about quite a bit. That sent me down this rabbit hole of sorts where I started learning about debt and the dollar and just sort of the nature of government and control and coercion and intimidation and essentially the way that it all works, central banking and everything. And it was shocking. I mean, that's not a word I really use lightly, but I come across people all the time that are sort of in various stages of that, awakening of sorts, where they realize it's the same deal, that not everything that they've, a lot of these things that they were brought up to believe, aren't actually true. And, you start realizing, well, wait a minute, I'm not actually really living in a free country, and I've got a government that'll take my children away if I don't bring them up in the right way. I'm not free to choose what to put in my own body or to collect my own rainwater that falls on my own roof on my own private property and all these things. And you start realizing this, and I know that a lot of those realizations, particularly some of the economic realities, when you realize that, the debt level is so extreme, that the net worth of the government is so extraordinarily negative, to the tune of negative $60 trillion. And then those can be really scary realizations. And I think what's interesting is that people deal with that in different ways. And I think two of the most powerful emotions we have in our species are really hope and fear. And the thing is that both of those drive us to do, in many respects, irrational things. When we're afraid, we do irrational things. And likewise, when we're hopeful, we do irrational things. And I think that kind of where we're at right now is that a lot of people maybe have some cursory understanding. Okay, yeah, there's a lot of debt out there, but they feel like everything's going to be okay. Those smart guys in Washington, or at the Federal Reserve or so on and so forth, are going to bail us out and everything's going to be just fine. And that's hope. And that hope leads people to do irrational things, which is to do precisely nothing. That in the face of such obvious risks, that hope drives us to do nothing, to have confidence in a system that has consistently failed us. Likewise, I think for a lot of people that realize, whoa, wait a minute, there's way too much debt, there's way too many issues, way too many challenges, and I think a lot of people react in the opposite way. And I've seen a lot of people completely freak out and sort of hit the panic button and just want to, make major upheavals and immediate changes in their life, which, I think both of those can cause a lot of problems. And I think essentially what we do and what our organization tries to do right now is help folks understand what's really happening and what the real solutions are, and take a very rational, measured, steady approach to solving those problems and controlling those risks.
As an American, that light bulb moment, as you grow up as a kid, you think about the flag, 4th of July, defeating the Soviet Union, the Cold War is over. There's just all these nice feelings. But when you have, and you just talked about that, when you have that light bulb moment, it's a punch to the gut. It's a real punch to the gut when you realize that the vast majority, actually every last one of the political leaders in the United States of America, have no caring for you. The only thing they care about is to sit in that seat and get the money, the adulation, and the power to lord over you, dear electorate.
It goes against everything that you're brought up to believe. And of course, most people are churned through a state-controlled education system where we're taught from a very early age to subordinate ourselves to authority and without question, really. Yeah, when you realize all those things, it is uncomfortable. In many cases, again, that discomfort can even, depending on what you're really looking at, it can lead to outright panic. I think that sense of unease can almost create as many problems for folks as ignoring all of those risks. And I think it's important to really strike a balance between all of that.
So let's get into some practical stuff. You've got a lot of practical experience that people can use. We're only going to have a chance to cover so many things today. If they want more, they can come knock on your door. I think one of the interesting topics that we can break apart in a lot of different directions, currency. And specifically, the physical currency that, at least for the time being, you can still have in your hand. I'm not sure what the number is right now, but I'm fairly certain that if you walk into any Bank of America branch in America and say, I'd like to take out $10,000 cash, there might be a red light that now goes off. You're going to have to sign your life away, and you probably can't take it at that moment in time. I want to contrast that with a conversation that I had with a friend the other day. He was in Singapore. He wanted to buy some gold. He walked into his Singaporean local branch office bank and said, I want to take out a couple $100,000. They basically were like, oh, what do you want to do? He's like, I got to go buy some gold. They're like, okay, here you go. Here's your money. Talk about that sum. I mean, that alone, what I just said might be shocking. Add some color, add some flavor to how bad you see the basic use of currency going, the directions we're going.
First of all, I think that everybody should have physical cash currency, and I don't say that lightly, because for I think for anybody that understands money and what money really is, and we can go back thousands of years when even before there was money and people were still using gold and silver in sort of shekel denominated weights and so forth. I mean, if anybody that really understands the nature of money, probably by nature abhors even the concept of paper currency. If you look at our financial system, we've got these grand wizards of central banks, unelected bureaucrats that are awarded totalitarian control over the money supply and can, on a whim, conjure trillions of currency units out of thin air in their sole discretion, and essentially in doing so manipulate the price of just about every asset on the planet. They control the entire financial system, which every single person in the world depends on for their life and livelihood, and then we call ourselves free. It's a completely bizarre system, and paper currency is a symbolic representation of that. That said, there are way too many challenges in the banking system and the financial system as a whole. And the way I kind of explain it to people is to try and help them understand that there are different forms of money, and I don't even like using the word money. We can say legal tender in a way. One form as an example would be a form of money that's used by very large investors, institutions, banks, sovereign wealth funds, governments, central banks, and so forth. And these are essentially government bonds, the most popular of which are U.S. government bonds. U.S. government bonds are, in accounting and financial speak, considered cash equivalents. When a Chinese sovereign wealth fund does a big deal in Brazil, they don't write a check for that. They're not paying in cash. Essentially, most of the time they'll transfer government bonds. When the International Monetary Fund does a deal with Afghanistan or something like that, they'll do these deals, essentially transact in bonds, typically U.S. government bonds. Now, that's a level of money that most of us never really touch. The next level of money that most of us are familiar with is banking cash, essentially savings accounts, checking account deposits, and so forth, and all that money is electronic. I always remind people this when we start talking about digital currency, and they say, well, I can't really conceptualize digital currency. You say, well, most currencies that we use are digital. The dollar's digital, the euro's digital, all these currencies are digital. It's less than 10% of the US dollar money supply is actually in physical cash. 90% of the money supply, at least, is in digits. And what does that mean? When you log on to you mentioned Bank of America, you log on to your Bank of America account, it's not like there's a vault filled with cash. If you've got whatever, $10,000, $100,000, $1 million sitting in your account, it's not like there's a vault filled with cash with the pieces of paper that represent every one of those digits in your account. No, your account is just nothing more than essentially entry in a database that exists somewhere in a building with no windows. And so whenever we conduct transactions, wire transfers, credit card payments, and so forth, all this stuff sort of happens in the cloud. It happens electronically. It happens digitally, and there's not really any physical representation of that. When you send a wire transfer to your buddy, there's no Pony Express with a guy on horseback with a satchel full of cash galloping across the countryside to deliver a suitcase full of money. It all happens electronically. Physical cash is another form of money, one that we all understand, and that's where you essentially no counterpart, and you've got it sitting there right in your hand. And the thing is that right now, what I've been trying to help people understand is that right now at this exact moment, those are three fundamentally different forms of money. They just happen to be right now, they all happen to share a 1-to-1-to-1 exchange rate. They're all essentially trading at parity in financial speak. That parity can break, that exchange rate, that 1-to-1-to-1 ratio between the amount of money in your bank account and the physical cash in your hand, that can break down very quickly. Cyprus is a great example of that. Back in 2013, the banking system in Cyprus went totally, all the banks were totally insolvent. The government wasn't in a position to bail them out, so they essentially froze the bank accounts of every single person in the country. All bank accounts in the entire country were frozen. So if you can imagine a situation like that, it didn't matter how much money you had in your bank account, because if you couldn't access it, the value of your savings account is completely worthless. And so you can imagine a situation like that cash in your hand suddenly had a huge premium, that if you had physical cash currency, then suddenly, overnight, that was worth so much more than any amount of money in a bank account because you couldn't access it. If you really understand the nature of money, you probably don't like the idea of cash or any of that, any fiat currency in general. The real truth is that physical cash actually is a very strong hedge against problems in the banking system. And if you're wondering, well, are there problems in the banking system? Yes, absolutely. And we can see that everywhere. In Europe, where we see negative interest rates, that absolutely destroys a financial system. It's turned it completely upside down, where you've got borrowers that are getting paid and savers that have to pay. I mean, negative interest rates are completely destructive. It has turned the whole idea of prosperity is quite simple. You have to produce more than you consume, and negative interest rates turn that equation upside down and make it much easier to consume and much more difficult to produce and to save. And that absolutely destroys a banking system where banks have huge disincentives against being conservative, responsible custodians of other people's money. And then you start looking at this in the United States, and all this is publicly available data. I'm not talking about anything this is no conspiracy theory. All you have to do is go onto the internet and look at download, pick any bank that you want, basically any major bank, and download their annual financial statements, download their quarterly financial statements, and look at their balance sheet, and you'll see essentially the cash and cash equivalents that they hold as a percentage of customer deposits, which they have in their liabilities column, is extremely low. And for some of the biggest banks in the world, we're talking 3%, 2%, 1%. This is the level of liquidity, essentially. It means that if more than 1% of their funds have to leave the bank, 1% withdrawals, and so forth, and the bank's not able to honor that commitment. In the meantime, they've got their balance sheets, their loan portfolios, their investment portfolios stuffed full of bonds that yield negative interest rates and other very shaky investment fads and so forth. Just exactly the same thing that happened in the subprime crisis. We're dealing with that Again, in 2008, what brought down the financial system is $1.3 trillion in the market that was on bank balance sheets of subprime loans. Today, there's $7 trillion in negative interest rates, negative interest rate bonds. And so to me, it's essentially the exact same challenges that we had in 2008, just almost an order of magnitude worse. And so you have to look at this data objectively and realize that probably doesn't have a happy ending. We already saw what happens when you pay people to borrow money. We saw what happens when banks make stupid decisions. And the only difference between loaning money to a subprime home buyer is that we're loaning money to subprime governments. We're loaning money to governments at negative interest rates. Even the United States, there are certain classes of bonds, specifically Treasury inflation-protected securities, that yield negative interest. So this is even in the United States, on the U.S. side of the Atlantic.
Let me tear this open a little bit. I brought up negative interest rates with my father recently. He's a dentist. He's in his early 70s. He's still practicing. Look, everyone knows there's been zero interest rates for the last who knows how long. But I brought up the idea of negative interest rates, and he just looked at me with his mouth open like, he's a smart guy. He's a doctor. But he was kind of trying to wrap his arms around it like, you mean they're going to take money from me each month? I tend to think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I tend to think that there's a generation of Americans that are perhaps up in age, some 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s for sure. This concept is not fully understood. They have no idea what's coming down the pike, do they?
Let's be honest, there's probably a lot of folks, regardless of age, who are totally unaware. And this is what I was talking about before, is it's hope versus fear. And I think the people that remain hopeful, they probably understand at a cursory level that there are a lot of challenges. They understand. You just have to look at the headlines and go, oh, okay, yeah, negative interest rates. Okay, yeah, debt. Okay, yeah, massive erosion of freedom and FBI versus iPhone and all these things. And I think people probably might have a cursory understanding of that. But we have a huge incentive to ignore it. And it's our inner hope that says, oh, well, everything's going to be just fine. And it's just such a bizarre thing. If you really sat down and showed somebody, okay, here's the financial statement of your bank. They don't have your money. They hold very little cash. They have very little security, have very little reserves. All the money's loaned out in these crazy investment fads. They're probably going to go under again. Is this really the safest place to hold your money? And if you look at it rationally, the answer is of course not. But again, it's that hope that kicks in to make us think, well, I'm sure they'll figure it out, and I'm sure it's going to be fine. And it's a completely irrational thing to do. If you look at bank balance sheets and you see these are not safe institutions, and to continue holding your money there and expecting there'll be no consequences is totally irrational. I agree with you. I think that the idea of sort of beginning to educate yourself about really not only what the problems are, but also the solutions. It's absolutely paramount. And I think sort of regardless of age, there is really a cloud over, a lot of people's thinking with this. And I think that has to do with just the way that we were all brought up to believe certain things, that everything's always going to be okay. This is America, the land of the free, and the government's always going to figure it out, and all these sorts of things. And those are myths. They're not really true.
Let me bounce out of that for a second, because you just mentioned America, land of the free. You look at freedom differently because you're not in America a significant portion of the year. Why don't you open up for the audience, explain your philosophy? And you are not looking to be, as you say, a slave to geography. Now, look, I get it. I get it deep in my bones because for the last 3 years, we could talk all day about this, but I get it. So I'm on the same page. But I think for the vast majority of people, especially, 70% of Americans don't have a passport. This slave to geography thing, try and give people that are perhaps in America or in Europe that have not done extensive travel and have not started to understand your birthplace might not be the best place for you to be your entire lifetime.
Well, I just hold it as an obvious, paraphrase some great folks, some self-evident truths, that to define oneself by the color of your passport is as ludicrous as defining yourself by the color of one's skin. It's a big world out there. And I'm fundamentally a very opportunity-driven guy. I'm an investor and an entrepreneur more than anything else. I run 5 different businesses all over the world. The various disparate things. I've got a huge agricultural project that I'm running, and just all kinds of different things. And it's exciting to me. I think this is one of the most exciting times to be alive. And I think if you look around, we have this opportunity because of our modern transport and technology. I mean, it wasn't that long ago there's a great book by a guy named Fitzroy McLean called Eastern Approaches. And this guy wrote, he was a British intelligence agent basically back in the 1930s. And this guy wrote about traveling to, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Siberia and all these places. I mean, it was almost, even in the 1930s, it was almost impossible to really travel around the world and see different countries and cultures and things like that. If you back up a few decades before that, I mean, a guy like Marco Polo is legendary and still famous centuries later because he was able to travel to different places around the world. And it's so easy for us right now. You could wake up on the other side of the planet tomorrow morning, and that's pretty extraordinary. And I look at it from through the lens of opportunity, just to see that there are so many amazing places in the world. And when you kind of slice and dice all the different elements of your life, the places, that sort of opportunities for business and opportunities for investment and opportunities for, the best places in the world, for your money to live, and the best places in the world for your children to be educated, the best places in the world to receive extremely high quality, cost effective medical care in all these places. And every country in the world really has something to offer. And when you expand your thinking to the rest of the world, when you expand your thinking to, your universe really goes so far beyond the place of your passport and the country of your birth. You really see that how many opportunities are out there. You're like, whoa, wait a minute, I can get extremely high quality healthcare for less than what I tip my barista at Starbucks. I can have these incredible lifestyle opportunities. I can live in this big swanky penthouse apartment that I can pick up for, less than the down payment on a parking spot in New York City. All these things that, are able to do, the lifestyle opportunities, the business opportunities and so forth, almost as a byproduct. You start to realize that when you expand your thinking so far beyond the place that you live, you realize how much more free you really feel. And freedom is subjective. There's not there's no freedom units that you can say I increased my freedom units by 7, whatever. It's just a way that you feel. And I know in my particular case, I just feel so free. I don't have any government bureaucrats breathing down my neck. I just did my entire life is essentially lived based on what I want to do in my own discretion, and not anybody else's.
By design.
Yeah, by design. And then I credit a lot of that really to expanding my thinking. Sure, I think it's possible that you can, you could live free without traveling the world and all these things. And then I think there's a lot of folks right now that are, particularly younger people, that are taking advantage of all the opportunities to travel. And I see a lot of folks, particularly in their 20s and maybe early 30s, that are out there traveling in the world and going from place to place and so forth. And I know there's a lot of people that think that's a lot of fun. But I would not necessarily say that travel equals freedom. I think that freedom is fundamentally a state of mind.
100%. You
can achieve that regardless of where you are, although it's certainly harder to really feel super free when you're spending 365 days a year in a growing, expanding, dominant surveillance state, police state. It becomes a lot more difficult to feel truly free in an environment like that. But it fundamentally comes down to the way that you think. And I think that expanding your whole process to the entire world and really what's available out there is a big step in that.
You brought up healthcare. Let's get a little specific for a moment. Perhaps you have a story, an anecdote, a country, a city. Give the audience some perspective on healthcare, especially for the American audience, another country, another experience, some price comparison.
I'll give you, this is a very recent example, but I have a very close friend who had to have back surgery in the United States. Couldn't afford it, but was in the pain was just debilitating. Basically had to have disc replacement, fusion, all this kind of stuff. And basically a total spinal overhaul, as it were. No insurance, obviously couldn't afford it. Basically, wrote the check for it and just to take care of her. And it was $165,000 in the United States. $165,000. Now, if you were to go to Bumrungrad Hospital in Thailand, in Bangkok, Thailand, I mean, that same thing would be maybe 5% of the price. That same kind of surgery. I mean, you're talking less than 10 grand, and you're getting it from Western trained physicians and surgeons. I mean, it's
they've gone to the same colleges in America, the best colleges, etc. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time in Thailand. I spent a lot of time in Asia. I'm running a few businesses out there. I'm on the board of directors for a couple of companies, and so I'm out in the region extensively. And I swing through Bangkok a lot, and I pop in and get things done. I in my old age, I seen I have my shoulders breaking down. I got problems with my knees. I mean, just sports injuries and whatever else. And so I go in from time to time, and I was with a doctor. I remember this woman. I mean, she's probably in her late 30s, gorgeous. I just have to say, gorgeous woman.
This happens in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, had a MD and PhD from Boston University. She's Thai and was working in the local hospital, and I had consultation and treatment and all that stuff, and then I went and I paid the bill, and it was less than $1,000 baht. It was like $30. After all that, I mean, it was unbelievable. It's just a fraction of a copay for folks, and it's just, and I look at the solutions to the rising cost of medical care. I have a problem saying healthcare because I don't think that medical care and healthcare are necessarily the same thing, particularly in big Western countries. And the solution is, you look at something like Obamacare that they pushed through, and they basically held a gun to everybody's head and said, you will have health insurance. And that's the solution. And I thought, this is just so crazy. And it really, it comes back. There's just so many other issues at stake. And when you just expand your thinking of that and you see how many other options and solutions out there, I mean, literally you could get on a plane and fly across the country and get top quality care and combine it with a vacation and spend still a fraction of what you would have to pay, in your home country. And so it's just an obvious, to me, it's just an obvious solution.
And by the way, I'm sure you probably agree with me on this. If you're coming from the States and you got to fly into Asia, maybe you connect into Tokyo and then come down to Southeast Asia, go ANA, go some Asian airline. Don't go on United, please.
Yeah, no, I've done the United flight. I think I did Tokyo to Chicago one day when there's really no other option. And yeah, that was pretty agonizing by comparison. I will say, in fairness though, I actually recently did DFW International to Hong Kong on American Airlines. They had a brand new, I think it was probably not brand new, but recently renovated 777. And that was actually really, really good. 17 and a half hours. It's a long flight, but that was actually probably the best trans-Pacific U.S. carrier flight that I've ever had. But usually, yeah, I almost exclusively try and fly Asian airlines in and out of Asia. I mean, Thai is fantastic, Singapore is fantastic, Korean Air, ANA, all these are just.
And by the way, if you just heard Simon say 17 and a half hours, you know what? They got a TV in front of you. You can watch 5 or 6 movies, and you wake up on the other side of the planet. It's worth the cost of admission.
Oh yeah, it's great. I mean, I didn't mean to say that to discourage anybody. But just to say, obviously, when you go 17 and a half hours, comfort's kind of important, and it was a great flight. I kind of use planes. I mean, when I travel long haul, to me, it's like a mini vacation. It's a great time to just kind of relax and unplug. I hate the fact that they're putting internet on flights now because it's that inner voice is telling you, oh, you should check in and see what everybody's doing. But I like the opportunity to unplug and just relax, for 5, 10, 12, 17 and a half hours at a time. And it's nice.
I mentioned this at the beginning. I saw this great article that you wrote up, and I'm sure some of my audience is tired of me talking about Vietnam, but you had this great piece that you put together on Vietnam recently. Actually, a friend of mine in Virginia sent it to me, and I then reached out to you. I'm going to go back to him and say, hey, listen to our podcast now. But what I loved about that piece is you talked about going from unfree to free, and you talked about the pulse, essentially the commerce pulse that you feel on the streets of a place like Saigon. Why don't you open that up from your perspective? Because to me, as an American, it still seems like the lessons. Let's say you like Vietnam. I don't want to go there. There was a war there. But if you get on a plane and you come here, there's this instant inspiration because you immediately realize, my God, we're not doing this kind of hustle in America anymore. We've stopped.
Well, that's the case all across Asia. I mean, if you go to China, if you go to Myanmar, if you go to Singapore, if you go to any of these places, I mean, you'll just see, there is an extreme commercial mindset where people are. It goes back to what I was saying before. It's about producing more than you consume, and I think the West and the United States in particular is primarily a consumption model. Asia is a production model. Asia is about production. The West is about consumption. People figured this out thousands of years ago during the Neolithic Revolution, when they realized that they could actually plant some seeds in the ground and grow more food than they could possibly consume, and that pool of savings that they were able to generate from essentially producing more food than they could possibly consume created this savings. That became the foundation for all civilization. I mean, it's as old. This concept is as old as civilization itself. The West is just in this. I mean, when you look at these economic statistics, you'll hear any high school economics student will hear about consumption is the consumer spending is 70% of the American economy. I mean, that's crazy. Think about that, and it's just not. In Asia, it is all about production, and you just see this everywhere you go. And in Asia, I mean, one of the things I love about it is the freedom to produce is so pronounced in Asia, where you just see people. You want to start a restaurant. You go get a table of chairs, and you just set up shop on the sidewalk with a little burner. And starts, serving noodles to people on the street, and that's your restaurant, that's your business, and there's just millions and millions of people who make their living from that way, and in this kind of wild east, kind of unregulated marketplace like that, and it's amazing, and that's the way it used to be in the West, and it's just no longer that case today.
What's really interesting about that thought too, Simon, is that the government structures in most of the Asian countries are either flat out communist or Singaporean benevolent dictator. Thai is essentially a military junta right now. But even though this government structures are kind of, as Americans, we might go, gosh, we don't like that. We've got the freedom to vote in America. We're so much different. But it doesn't affect the commerce on the ground, does it?
No, not at all. I mean, it's all different varieties of the same thing. I mean, any form of government is essentially, a political establishment that takes the power at the expense of the people. And I don't care what you call it. You could call it a representative democracy or a Republican form of government. You could call it a military dictatorship. At the end of the day, there's a political establishment that exercises, tremendous control and rules through fear and intimidation, at the expense of the people. So I mean, I know there's a lot of folks in the West that think that they're, more free and so forth. But I mean, if you really look at how does it translate to on the ground? I would encourage anybody, in Kansas City to just walk down the street in the middle of the sidewalk and try and start a noodle shop on the sidewalk and see how long that lasts, And as you alluded to earlier, try and walk into your bank and say, hey, I'd like $10,000 in cash, and see how fast they start treating you like a criminal terrorist. I mean, that's all these things, it counts. The way it translates to on the ground, again, you feel like you have a lot more, you just feel a lot more free because you're able to do so much more. And I think that actually carries even more weight as a foreigner when you're overseas.
I think Americans have forgot how to break the rules a little bit. I think breaking rules, I mean, that's how we used to be. You break some rules, you move forward, you do something big. Today, we just kind of sit there like, like seals, waiting, clapping, waiting for somebody to give us a snack.
That's an interesting analogy. I think, in fairness, it's not really just the United States. It's a lot of countries in the West. I was in Australia recently. Just actually closed on a business there, and it's so interesting to me. I mean, this is a place that was founded by kind of felons and convicts and so forth, and yet it's a extremely highly regulated society in Australia. I was actually thinking that exact same thing. I thought, man, for an island with that we used to be a prison colony, these guys are rabid rule followers over here, and I think that's sort of a phenomenon that has taken over the West. I think a lot of it is probably due to this this highly indoctrinated sense of security culture. That there's just everybody's been sort of whipped into a state of fear over a lot of things, irrational fears about things. It's just sort of made people very docile and compliant, rule followers. But yeah, I think you're exactly right.
I know you're a fan of, and I'm sure you're probably an associate of, but I've had a chance to go over and visit Mark Faber at his place in Chiang Mai a couple years ago. Have you had a chance to go over and visit him there?
Oh yeah, I went to his house last summer. It's a beautiful place, like a museum.
Yeah. Tell me he is the quintessential, because I'm a little bit younger than Mark. I think you're a little bit younger than Mark, but he is truly the guy that has done his own thing. I mean, you can flip on the finance channels and you see his face, but most of the time he's probably just hanging out at his place in Chiang Mai, enjoying life, doing his thing. But he is truly, to me, seems like a great definition of a sovereign man.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's somebody that's that has that mindset that they're responsible for themselves and essentially to live free and independent. It's a sense of self-reliance more than anything, and I think that again, a lot of people in the West have lost that. If you go back even to recent history, there used to be that people didn't always look to the government to solve their problems and to fix the economy and all these sorts of things, and there was something that was down to the individual level to be responsible for their own security and safety and prosperity and production and so forth. And it's just not really the case anymore. And I think this idea is actually quite sad, because the whole concept of sovereignty, is almost be sovereign. The word sovereign has become a dirty word. It's been sort of expropriated, by groups of people that go around and are now labeled domestic terrorists and so forth. And just so even to use the word sovereign is almost a dirty word. And it's quite sad, because ultimately what we're really talking about is individual freedom and independence. And that's something that I think that anybody should strive for.
Why don't you give the audience some perspective on your day-to-day? So in the next couple months, how many different countries will you be in? Where are you headed?
A lot of things in my life are very unpredictable. Just have so many different muscle movements going on. We're in the process of planting 2 million various trees on the over 5,000 acres that we own right now. I may try and swing up to Cuba. Actually, I haven't been there in a little while. And I know I'll actually be in the United States for a little bit in, I think, late April. So that's probably about the next 30 days or so. But yeah, in general, as a rule, I tend to not spend winter anywhere. So I swap hemispheres every 6 months. I usually spend, kind of June, July, August time frame in Europe, and Asia, and just in the Northern Hemisphere in general. And yeah, I just tend to travel a lot. Probably in any given year, I'll hit anywhere between 35 and 55 countries. Again, now that I just bought another business in Australia, and I have several others to run, and so life can be pretty unpredictable. But it's a lot of fun, and I'm incredibly thankful and grateful for the lifestyle that I've been able to achieve, and just feeling free and able to do my own thing and living independently, and it's fantastic.
I love how Doug Casey defined it to me: the PT, the perpetual tourist.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people. You would use different. People say prior taxpayer and or perpetual traveler or so forth. These days I spend. If you add up all the days I'm in all the places in the world, I probably spend most of my time. The biggest number is certainly in Chile, but even that's probably at this point I'd say less than 6 months out of the year, and then the other 6-7 months is in, again, probably 40, 50 different countries. But I do it because I think there's a lot of opportunity in the world. I'm not negatively minded. I'm not full of doom and gloom. I think, again, this is one of the most exciting times to be alive, and there's just so much. I just think there's so much opportunity out there. Yeah, sure, there are big problems. There are entire nations that are bankrupt, and the financial system has been turned completely upside down by absurd central bank policy, and there's an ominous rise of police and surveillance states. But there are solutions. These are problems, and there's solutions to those problems. Once you kind of get past solving the problems, you step back and look at the big picture and expand that mindset to the whole world. You realize how much opportunity there really is, and not even just investment, financial, business opportunity, but even lifestyle opportunity to just live a better, freer, happier life. And all that's really out there and possible.
Simon, the best place to find you and your firm, Assorted Services, sovereignman.com?
Sure.
Yep. Hey, I appreciate it. Thank you. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.